Forum, co-hosted by The Appeal and Now This. I'm Josie Duffy-Rice. I'm president of The Appeal. I thank everyone for joining us today, and I'm so excited to welcome our guests to this forum. There are actually 4 candidates in the Democratic primary for 9th Judicial Circuit State Attorney in Florida, which covers Orange and Osceola counties. The primary will be held on August 18th. The winner will go against non-party candidate Jose Torriella in the November general election. All 4 candidates in the race were invited to participate in the forum, and the 3 who were able to join us today were Deborah Barra, Ryan Williams, and Monique Worrell. So some brief background about the candidates. Deborah Barra is the current Chief Assistant State Attorney with 16 years as a prosecutor. Belvin Perry Jr., who's not able to join us today, is a former 9th Circuit Chief Judge. Ryan Williams is an Assistant State Attorney for the 5th Judicial Circuit with 12 years as a prosecutor. And Monique Worrell is a former Assistant State Attorney, public defender, defense attorney, and law professor. And she is currently the Chief Legal Officer for Reform Alliance. So I'm going to give a little introduction. I'll lay out exactly how the forum is going to go, and then we'll get started. As you all know, several crises are colliding right now in America. So the killings of George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, and Breonna Taylor, among, countless others, right? The violent police responses to peaceful protests of that violence, and the grave threat posed by COVID-19, particularly to vulnerable communities and people of color. These crises are exposing real inadequacies of the legal system and also real differences of opinion on how to truly pursue justice and equity. With over 1.3 million residents, the 9th Judicial Circuit is one of the largest circuits in Florida, and the state attorney makes decisions that impact the lives of the circuit residents and really has the power to shape and change criminal legal system policy. So candidates, we're going to begin with a 90-second opening statement from each of you. Starting with, we will start with Ms. Worrell, and then we'll move on to a question and answer period. You'll each have 90 seconds to respond to each question, and I'll follow up if I need to. So candidate opening statements, Ms. Worrell, you may now offer your opening statement.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monique Worrell. I am the criminal justice reform candidate in this race. And in light of everything that you said about the things that are happening in our country and some of those things even happening here in our community, what we need right now is criminal justice reform in a major way. And I say I'm the criminal justice reform candidate because I am the only candidate in this race who has actually dedicated my entire career to criminal justice reform. I started my career as a public defender. I went on to be a private defense attorney. Then as a law professor, I trained my students to fight for fairness and equality in the criminal legal system. I trained many public defenders as well as state attorneys who are currently practicing throughout the state and some throughout the country. I went on to become an assistant state attorney, but in that way, I was the director of conviction integrity, where I led for the advocacy of the exoneration of wrongful convictions. And then I went on to be the chief legal officer of Reform Alliance, a nonprofit that focused on probation and parole reform. I believe that my experience in the criminal legal system has prepared me to now lead the charge in changing our legal system in Central Florida towards reform, incarceration as a last and not a first resort, and protecting our citizens from police misconduct and brutality upon our citizens.
Thank you so much, and we're so glad that you're here. Ms. Barra, you may now offer your opening statement.
Thank you very much. I had to unmute myself, so I apologize for the delay. I'm Deborah Barra. I have been a prosecutor for 17 years in Orange and Osceola counties. I've prosecuted every type of case from misdemeanors to the death penalty. Some cases I'd like to highlight. I prosecuted a politician for the crime of bribery. I've prosecuted police officers for various crimes. And I've also received the first life sentence on an individual who was sexually trafficking a juvenile. But in addition to my extensive trial experience, which I think is really important in this race because you're leading an office of prosecutors, so you have to know how to prosecute a case. And you just can't be one issue driven because the Office of the State Attorney is a large entity with a lot of different issues. And I have served in a management capacity within the office over 3 different elected state attorneys. And that has given me kind of a front row seat in terms of what works, what doesn't work, and what we can do different. And so for the past 17 years, I've been implementing the policies of others, and I'm really looking forward to in January implementing my own policies because we have to make real change. And I believe that you have to know the system and you have to know it really well as it currently stands so that you know how to change it from within, because that's the only way that you're going to make lasting change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Thank you. So my name is Ryan Williams. I started working as a prosecutor straight out of law school and have done so mostly uninterrupted for about 13 years now. And in that time, I have also prosecuted pretty much any type of case you can imagine, from misdemeanors all the way up to first-degree murder. And I'm running for state attorney because I believe in justice for victims, but also in respecting and safeguarding the rights of the accused, and that I don't believe we should have to choose between doing those 2 things. I believe we can and must do both. So a good portion of my career has been spent prosecuting violent crime, including sex crimes and child abuse, for close to 3 years, back before I had children of my own. So I really acknowledge that I care deeply about victims and protecting our community from the relatively small number of people who endanger us. But I certainly recognize that prosecutors have an obligation to do justice under the law, and that there are significant aspects of our criminal justice system that are unjust. So I think we find ourselves at an important moment with the opportunity to reform longstanding policies on things like cash bond, minimum mandatory sentences, the war on drugs, and a juvenile justice system that is anything but just. I'm sure we'll talk about those today. But I'm also the son of a convicted felon who is still incarcerated, and I have a more personal experience with the often overlooked side of the criminal justice system and the impact that it has not only on the accused, but on their families. So I stand ready to use both my professional and personal experiences to protect our community and lead it through what I think is an important time for reform. And I appreciate the invitation this afternoon.
Thank you to all 3 of you. So let's get started with some questions. The protests we're seeing across the country are kind of coming at a unique moment, right? Cities and states are slashing budgets for things like housing, education, healthcare during this pandemic. And for the most part, police budgets are remaining fairly untouched, or in some places are even growing. Ms. Barra, what is your position on shifting public safety budgets by moving resources away from traditional law enforcement and investing in alternative public safety programs?
I don't think we need to cut their funding. I think that they need to spend their funding differently. I think that public safety is always going to be paramount and that you can't sacrifice that. And I think what we're seeing is that the way police right now is not appropriate. I don't think that there needs to be less police. I think that there need to be different police. And here's what I mean by that. I think that law enforcement officers need to be trained on de-escalation. I think that they need to be trained on mental health issues. I think that a law enforcement officer needs to have people skills. They need to come in and interact with citizens, not from a more military perspective or an aggressive perspective, but from a human being perspective. And I think right now what's missing is that a lot of agencies, they hire former military and they hire the people who, yes, we absolutely need. I mean, we need SWAT. That is a very valuable tool for a law enforcement agency. You know, we are the home of Pulse nightclub, and we needed officers to go in there and to take care of the people who are inside that building. So you absolutely need a percentage of law enforcement that have those skill sets. But I would say 90% of the time, or at least, or probably even 95% of the time, you need people who know how to interact with people and who aren't going to aggressively go towards them and immediately start escalating when they should be de-escalating. So I think that you're going to need money to do a lot of retraining of law enforcement and maybe different hiring of law enforcement, that the agencies need to focus on different things.
Ms. Vera, I just want to follow up quickly with you.
Yeah.
I think the concern that a lot of people have is that we are asking law enforcement to do things they shouldn't be doing.
Right.
And so why would we retrain law enforcement to do things that social workers could do, that emergency first responders could do, rather than divert those funds to hire and to retain people who have a different skill set?
Yeah, I don't think that social workers can do the work in the field that I've heard proposed. I don't think that's appropriate, and I think it's a safety risk for social workers. I've seen many examples where, say, somebody is having a mental health crisis and they're violent. And I think they're sending in a social worker into that situation where they are armed with knives and guns, and their family has called the police because they don't know what to do with this individual. I don't think that putting in a social worker is going to change or help that situation. I think that you need law enforcement there because they do have skill sets that are necessary, but they need to be trained in what to look for and how to de-escalate. But they still have to act, and you still have to take care of the issue. And sending in social workers in a situation where somebody is armed with a firearm and they're going through a mental health crisis, I don't think is the way. I think you're just endangering more people.
I want to move on to Mr. Williams, but I'd also like to maybe try to come back to you, Ms. Vera, if we have
Absolutely.
enough time, because I think a lot of these people are not armed, and we want to know what would we do in situations where there maybe isn't an immediate danger, but that having an armed person increases the tension and the struggle. So, Mr. Williams, if you could answer the question, and then we'll try to move around.
Yes, ma'am. May I call you Miss Rice? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I have like a million last names. Go with whatever you want.
Fair enough. So the situation you're describing is happening here in Florida. Governor DeSantis has a veto power in Florida and just cut multiple millions of dollars for public housing. Yet in Orange County, the sheriff's proposed budget adds $15 million to his budget for that agency. So I am comfortable with shifting resources from law enforcement to, I guess the term you've used is social workers, individuals with different skill sets that address some of the needs that the community has. I don't think I think we ask law enforcement to do too much. And I don't think that all the officers are equipped to do all the things that people who have special training can do. So while I don't necessarily want to reduce the number of law enforcement, I think we need to add individuals with those special skill sets. And I'll tell you why I don't think we can release or reduce the number of officers. I mean, even emergency medical personnel won't go into certain situations without law enforcement accompanying them. They wait for scenes to be cleared by law enforcement. The problem is when law enforcement does get there and secures a scene and makes it safe, we need to make sure that we have people with skill sets like training in domestic violence de-escalation when there's a DV call and maybe one person needs to be talked to rather than shot or another bad outcome occurs. So I think we've tried it the other way, and now it is a good time to try to shift resources from one to the other.
Thank you. Ms. Worrell, I'd like to hear your answer.
Thank you. You know, police play a critical role in our society and ensuring public safety, and we absolutely need them to respond to and investigate serious crimes that occur in our community. However, as has been said, we do ask them to do too much. And I agree that we'd be better off reducing their roles and responsibilities, for example, by hiring non law enforcement responders to address things such as mental health crises, substance abuse, overdose, or homeless, because that's another area where we have law enforcement interaction that's not always appropriate. And of course, we need stable communities. So one of the most important ways that we can prevent crime is by providing all of our residents with stable housing, quality education, meaningful employment. But to do this requires funding. And if there is really just one pot to distribute, by reducing the role and responsibilities of law enforcement, we can shift some of our limited resources to help improve housing, education, and employment. Another area that we see law enforcement that we could use less is in our schools, because as we know, the school to prison pipeline is directly impacted by having law enforcement in our schools in roles that should really be by trained professionals who know how to deal with children. So yes, I agree that we should be shifting some of that funding towards the community and utilizing non-law enforcement trained individuals to deal with those situations.
So let's stay on the topic of policing briefly. And I'm going to go back to you, Ms. Vera. There's been an increased focus on the role of police unions in the operation of the criminal legal system, the power they have, the influence they have. And so critics of police unions are sort of assert that they prevent accountability and they foster sort of secrecy around policing. And there's also concern that prosecutorial reliance on police officers to bring and make cases creates a dynamic where prosecutors are unable and perhaps unwilling to hold officers and departments accountable. There's obviously a fairly symbiotic relationship between prosecutors and police. You rely on them as investigative sources and for many things, as we know, as the criminal justice system is set up. So there have been calls in some places to start to disentangle this close relationship by having prosecutors reject financial contributions from police unions. So starting with you, Ms. Barrow, what's your position on accepting these contributions? And more broadly, if elected, what will you do to make sure that police officers are held accountable?
Well, so I've spent my career holding police officers accountable. So I think like criminal justice reform and calling out police misconduct isn't new to me. I have spent 17 years doing just that. I have had cases where I believe that law enforcement acted inappropriately and it was dropped. I have personally prosecuted 3 law enforcement officers because they committed a crime. And I don't see it as we are so linked together, because that's not how I practice law. The role of the state attorney and the assistant state attorneys is to do justice. And I call witnesses in order to do justice, but I call civilian witnesses as well as law enforcement witnesses. If I find that somebody's not credible, I don't care who they are, I'm not calling them as a witness. So in terms of accepting money from police agencies, and if what I am doing in the way that I practice law and the standard that I set, if law enforcement wants to support that, which I think they should, because I think that law enforcement should recognize that we only want good law enforcement officers and the bad ones need to go. And that's what I've been doing with my career. And if they wanted to support me, then great. But they would have to know that that money doesn't come with any extra ties or any promises. Everybody is equal under the law, and that their money doesn't influence how I treat law enforcement at all. I can't hear you.
Okay, Ms. Worrell, I'd love to hear your answer, and then we'll do some follow-up after we hear from the other 2 candidates.
Yeah, so I think it's inappropriate for a prosecutor to take contribution from police unions. I think it's very important for the state attorney to maintain neutrality, and that requires a certain distance from police and police unions. And the state attorney should want to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. And police unions, in particularly, play a large role in protecting police officers who commit misconduct and engage in violence. You know, my opponents talk about the fact that they have prosecuted, I believe, 3 law enforcement officers apiece in their careers. Ms. Barra's 17 years, and I believe Mr. Williams 12. the reality of it is Central Florida has one of the highest rates of excessive force in the country. A study showed that in a 5-year period, we paid out more than $3 million for excessive force. So for them to say that they take misconduct by police seriously, but yet they can only account for 3 law enforcement officers that they prosecuted, I think speaks to the fact that we're not dealing with reality. The reality is that police misconduct, excessive force, brutality is real across the country, and it's real here in Central Florida. And in order to hold individuals accountable, we have to prosecute them for those minor acts of brutality so that we can prevent the major acts of brutality from taking place. And most recently, and I'll just end with this, there was a case that came back to surface about a law enforcement officer from OPD who had his knee on the neck of someone that he has in handcuffs. And that video's resurfaced, and that individual wasn't prosecuted.
Thank you. Mr. Williams, I'd like to hear your answer, and also just any response you may have for Ms. Worrell.
Sure. So I do not believe it's inappropriate, sort of per se, as we're all lawyers here, to take money from police unions. Full disclosure, as anybody can see my finance reports, I have received money, a few $1,000s from police unions here locally, not nationally. My position on that is that I don't believe it creates any larger conflict than it does to receive money from defense attorneys whose clients and who are going to appear directly in front of the state attorney or the prosecutors that the state or district attorneys serve. And I've actually received a lot more money from defense attorneys here locally than I have from police unions. I do think that that money needs to be public, because there's a difference between police unions supporting political action committees and sort of doing it quietly so that the public can't see it and backing candidates that way. It needs to be public and people need to know, because if a candidate receives money from a police union and then demonstrates a record of not holding police accountable, then I think there's a pretty direct correlation that can be made, and people need to be aware of that. As Ms. Worrell mentioned, I have personally tried 3 police officers, for 2 of them for excessive use of force. And I think my record indicates that I am willing to hold police accountable when it's necessary. So I think that was the end of your answer, or the end of your question.
And Ms. Barra, do you have a response to the concern of police union contributions indicating a conflict of interest, or really saying to constituents more broadly that there's a concern that you'll be unwilling to hold police officers accountable?
No, I think that they're 2 separate issues. I mean, you could take any organization that has an agenda. And if they give money to a candidate, are you automatically going to assume that they're in line with everything that that organization stands for? And I think the answer to that is no. I think that everybody has a right to support whoever they want to support, as long as the candidate understands that they don't owe anybody anything. And that's where I stand, is that to me, there is nobody that I owe. I am not part of a good old boy network. I don't have favors that I need to give. I am very independent. And as you're aware, campaigns, they cost money, and people get money from all different types of sources. I mean, an argument could be made that receiving money from people who are not in this community is a negative thing, because they don't know the real issues attacking this community or facing this community. There's an argument to be made that defense attorneys, providing money to campaigns is to curry favor for their client in the future. I mean, you could look at anybody who donates money and believe or link that candidate now owes them something, which I just don't think it means that.
I hear that argument. I would also just posit that at least people outside of the community are not people that you all will ever have to deal with in a case, right? I mean, I understand that they may not know the particulars of your jurisdiction, but they're not going to be facing the state attorney in a case, and they're not going to be working with the state attorney in a case. So I think in that way, there's a difference. I wonder if you all think there's I guess you have answered this, that there's really no difference in the way that you're viewing donations from defense attorneys to donations from police unions.
No, I don't think that there is. It's everybody has a right to support who they want to support, and I don't think that to say a class of people shouldn't exercise that right, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Ms. Worrell, you had a response?
Yeah, I did. And I don't liken it to contributions from defense attorneys. You know, retired Judge Perry received the support of one of the police unions. And in their own words, they said they're supporting him because they believe that he has their back. So to me, that basically puts it out there that they are expecting certain treatment in return for their support and for their endorsement. In addition to that, it also makes a difference. What does the unit or entity that's supporting you stand for? What are their principles and what are their values? And what we know about police unions is that they have relentlessly supported and protected law enforcement officers who have been engaged in the type of misconduct that led to the murder of George Floyd. So I think that what the entity stands for is very important in determining, whether or not there's a conflict in receiving that contribution.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to move through questions faster because you guys are great to talk to and I'm running behind. So I am going to move on to the next one. So in the middle of the night on March 13th, Louisville police executed a no-knock warrant and entered 26-year-old Breonna Taylor's apartment. They opened fire. They hit Breonna at least 8 times, killing her. Police found nothing illegal in her home, and the person they were searching for was actually already in custody and not presumed to be at that apartment. So the tactics they used are employed by police departments all over the country, right, with disastrous results. And they're dangerous for both civilians and police officers. In the wake of Taylor's death, the Louisville City Council has passed a law now banning no-knock warrants altogether. So let's start with you, Mr. Williams. What's your position on creating a policy prohibiting prosecutors from supporting law enforcement requests for no-knock warrants and publicly supporting a ban on no-knock warrants?
I think no-knock warrants are problematic for the reasons that you just laid out. I am hesitant to support a blanket policy that law enforcement can never use a no-knock warrant. The reason that they exist, as I'm sure everybody can gather, even if they don't know from your comments, is that there are certain circumstances where law enforcement is going to go to a home where they believe a dangerous person to be, and they don't want to give the opportunity to that person to put them or other residents of the home in danger. Clearly, the officers in Louisville acted either in bad faith, and I know this is an ongoing investigation, what I understand of that situation, and or had very bad information. So I would be in support of a policy that raised the bar, that would require evidentiary findings beyond what is normal for a warrant or an arrest warrant that's no knock versus one that would require notification of the residents in the home. Because one situation where an innocent individual like Ms. Taylor is dead is one too many. But I'm hesitant to give a blanket situation or a blanket policy that would completely prohibit the policy.
Ms. Worrell, what's your take on this?
No-knock warrants are dangerous. They're dangerous for residents and they're dangerous for the police. There's no clearer example than what happened to Breonna Taylor, because in that situation, a law enforcement officer was shot and Breonna Taylor was killed because they broke into their house in the middle of the night. Now, especially here in Florida, where having a firearm in your home is legal and defending yourself is also legal. I say here in Florida because having a firearm in your home is not legal in every state, but here it is. We invite danger for our law enforcement officers as well as our residents, because when there is a mistake and you enter the wrong home, then you run the risk of killing someone that shouldn't be killed. You also run the risk of having law enforcement officers shot at by someone who believes that their homes are being broken into. So a model warrant execution should be protecting the safety of people. all people, and the broad use of no-knock warrants is inconsistent with that goal. There's simply no justification in my mind for breaking into someone's house unannounced in cases where human life is not in danger.
And Ms. Barra, can you answer?
Sure. I think that there's enough exceptions to the warrant requirement that no knock warrants shouldn't exist. If there is a situation where there's exigency and that they need to get into a location, that they have the ability to do that. I don't think that, I think no knock warrants establish more of a safety risk than the benefit that results from them.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Staying on the subject of law enforcement, and then we're going to move on from the police, but I want to turn to the issue of what are known as Brady lists or no-call lists, which is when prosecutors identify officers who are deemed too untrustworthy to testify in criminal matters based on prior misconduct. So last year, the current state attorney, Osceola, announced a policy to create a Brady list that would identify local law enforcement with questionable credibility or who's considered too untrustworthy to testify. And starting with Ms. Worrell, what's your position on this? If elected, would you implement a Brady policy and make the list publicly available? I guess that's two questions. One is, would you have the list? And two is, would that list be publicly available?
So yes, I would definitely have the list. I was still working in the office when the list came about, and I was in support of it then, and I remain supportive of the list. I think that list is helpful uh, for the credibility of the state attorney's office and for law enforcement officers who are doing their jobs properly by holding law enforcement officers who have credibility issues or issues of misconduct accountable, and making sure that they're names appear on a list so that they can be barred from testifying if necessary. I think that's essential to restoring faith from the community in the criminal legal system. Now, whether or not it would be public depends. There's a lot of intricate legal details that go into that with regards to defamation, with regards to law enforcement officer protections. So if we're able to do that, then yes, I think it should be public. But I think it's very important to know that I will be working with the heads of the law enforcement the divisions to have an understanding that their officers are being placed on the list, why their officers are being placed on the list, and then providing that information to defense counsel so that any interaction or evidence or information that's necessary for them to know in defense of their cases can be made known.
Thank you. Ms. Barra.
Yes, I'm in support of it. I'm actually on the Brady committee, and I meet regularly to discuss law enforcement officers and their credibility and what to do with them and what level do they rise to. It's really important that prosecutors in the office, when they're making charging decisions, know if an officer has credibility issues, because we obviously get sworn statements from law enforcement. And if this is somebody that we know has had credibility issues in the past, then that assistant state attorney needs to know that and they need to act on that. And I think that it will prevent a lot of unjust charging based on the fact that we have this list and that it's available for all of the attorneys to see whenever they are working up a case, because it's important at that level in terms of before everything even gets started for the ASA to know who this person is and what issues they have with their testimony. So in terms of that being public, it's going to be public no matter what, because we are we have sunshine laws and we have public record laws, and anytime that something is created, somebody can do a public record request and get it. So I don't have a problem with it being public so that people can understand and see what's going on. I think transparency is really important in a prosecutor's office.
Thank you. Mr. Williams.
Yes, I support the creation of a list. Yes, I support the fact that it should be public. For all of the reasons that have been stated by Ms. Worrell and Ms. Barra, I think we're largely in agreement. I'm happy to restate them if you like, but I think they covered the question and I agree with both of them.
Thank you. So let's move on let's start with COVID-19. So I'd love to hear from all of you about what specific criminal justice policy failings COVID-19 has exposed in your district in Orange and Osceola counties. And what would you do to change those policies and practices within the state attorney's office? Are there any, so I'll just give some examples. During COVID-19, some jurisdictions have been reducing the number of people detained pre-trial for tactical violations or releasing elderly individuals serving long sentences in response to the threat of an outbreak. Those are just some of the things that we're seeing nationwide. Are there examples, either those or others, of things that you would do and focus on as a state attorney? Mr. Williams, let's start with you.
I think two big things, and both of them are you alluded to in your lead-in. Pretrial incarceration is overused. If in this emergency circumstance we feel comfortable releasing people who are awaiting trial, then I think it speaks to the large number of people who are incarcerated for that period of time while they're awaiting their trial that don't need to be. And the over incarceration or the use of incarceration in situations where individuals do not pose a threat to society. It's the same principle. You have individuals who are serving sentences for minor offenses whose sentences are being reduced or cut short because they're not a danger to society. So I think any rational person says to themselves, well, then why were they locked up in the first place if they weren't dangerous? Because I don't believe anybody is suggesting that dangerous people be released despite the virus. So what would I do? We have collectively discussed in other forums the need to reduce the use of cash bond for pretrial release. I have said and will say now that I think it's difficult to completely do away with cash bond in Orange County. First of all, the judge in Orange County and Osceola County set bond. But we have to have some mechanism to allow people or to assure that they appear for court, even if they're not a danger. And that takes resources, a pretrial release system that is sufficiently staffed to ensure that people do appear in court in a timely fashion and don't end up with no bond warrants, which makes the situation even worse than it would have been initially. I've also talked about the need to reduce incarceration for minor offenses and eliminate incarceration for minor offenses that don't pose a threat to the community. And you can do that a variety of ways. And the primary way I've discussed is through the use of diversionary programs, widening it and eliminating barriers that currently exist, like previous use of pretrial diversion.
And Ms. Worrell, what is your response to the efforts that have been being made kind of nationwide in response to the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to the prosecutor's office?
Yeah, so I think what it's done is it's clearly illustrated how we incarcerate entirely too many people. It hasn't changed how I address public safety. It's just reinforced the need to change our reliance on punishment and incarceration. I knew this all along, and this is one of the main reasons that I'm running for state attorney. We need to reduce our reliance on incarceration. There's no reason that we should be incarcerating the elderly, people who have committed victimless or nonviolent crimes, or those who've committed technical violations of probation. For far too long, incarceration's been the first resort. We need to change how the criminal justice system operates so that the vast majority of cases, incarceration is used only when necessary to protect the public. Under my leadership, incarceration will be a last resort. We'll stop seeking jail and prison time when it's not necessary to protect the physical safety of others. COVID's created a situation where incarceration is an immediate threat to the physical health of individuals in our jails and prisons, but it always has been. So we need to limit the degree in which we use it and reserve it for those who truly pose a threat to the safety of others.
So some of the most vulnerable people in this pandemic are the unhoused and those struggling. Did I get everybody's answer?
No.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay.
My order's out of order. Yes, please, Ms. Vera.
Sure. So for the past 2.5 months, well, Yeah, for about almost 3 months now, I was tasked with making sure that the people who are in jail are only the people who need to be in jail. And I personally probably agree to hundreds of people being released on their own recognizance. I've stipulated to bond to get people out of the jail because it's significant, and it's significant at all times. I think that the judiciary, though, was finally on board during a pandemic to get people out of the jail because they recognize that that's important. And so, as state attorney, I need to make sure that the judiciary stays in terms of that mindset, and that this isn't something that is unique to pandemics, but it's important throughout. And so one of the things that I would do is meet with the judiciary, because they are the people who ultimately decide bond. The state attorney's office can recommend whatever we want to recommend for as long and as loud as we can, but the judge determines that. So you have to meet with them, and you have to get them on board with the fact that bond shouldn't exist. Cash bond shouldn't exist for people who are just can't afford to pay it. There's no rationale behind that.
Thank you. So some of the most vulnerable people in this pandemic are the unhoused and those struggling with mental illness. Many within these groups tend to be overrepresented in the criminal justice system because counties lack the resources to appropriately address their needs. And we know that these are the communities where social distancing is hard, right? Putting into place some of the kind of guidelines that the rest of us may be able to operate with are much more difficult if you're homeless, much more difficult if you're suffering from mental illness. So starting with you, Ms. Vera, what specific steps will you take to ensure that a person's lack of stable housing, their poverty, their mental illness does not affect their interaction with the criminal legal system?
Yeah, sure. So we see that, we've seen that a lot in Central Florida in terms of, panhandling and people being arrested, and trespass is another crime that we see a lot, where somebody gets trespassed and they get arrested and they have to spend time in jail as a result of it. And, that is not, I believe, issues for the criminal justice system. A simple trespass is simply because they don't have a place to be. And I think that we have to work with law enforcement in order to make sure that we are focused on the people that the criminal justice system needs to focus on. Mental health, there's a wide range of issues that come up with mental health. Simply somebody who is nonviolent versus somebody who has violent tendencies, because you have to keep the community safe. And so, unfortunately, right now, there is no place that is sufficient in the community to deal with those types of issues. I think that the issue you raise is important, and it's much larger than the state attorney's office. But as state attorney, I would support organizations and groups that focus on alternatives for mentally ill, much more than jail or prison.
Is this, do you think, one of the places where reshifting money, and I guess this is part of the question for everybody, could be useful if we're seeing that there are people who are mentally ill, and I think everybody would agree with you that often these people end up in the criminal justice system because there's just no place else for them to go, which ends up being functionally an albatross around the necks of people who work in the criminal justice system, like the three of you. Is this a place where those resources should be shifted to authorities and to departments that may be better equipped at dealing with mental health?
Well, my thing is, I don't feel like, taking it from law enforcement as the only pool is the answer. I think that there needs to be more funding for this. And I don't think that when we're talking about alternatives and places where people can go, I don't think that's a part of law enforcement, and I don't think it's a part of the state attorney's office. I think that the community as a whole needs to get together and fund organizations that can help. So where the money comes from, that's that's a different issue in terms of how to fund it. But I think as a community, we need to fund it.
Ms. Worrell, what would your response be to this?
I think that's certainly one of the community resources that can benefit from diverting funds to law enforcement and taking them out of places that we probably shouldn't have had them to begin with. Uh, our approach to cases should take all factors into consideration, and I'll encourage my line prosecutors to do that. We should be eliminating asks for money bail. We should ensure that people are noticed for their next court date through means other than the mail, just in case they're homeless. We should eliminate fines and fees associated with diversion programs, waiving cost of supervision when possible for probation and community control. And we just really need to treat people who encounter the criminal justice system with humanity so that whatever their circumstances are, we can move them towards stability and the well-being that will reduce the likelihood of them reoffending. This is part of public safety. We have to shift our focus from thinking that public safety is just this thing. It's just this way. We take people who offend, we incarcerate them, and now we have public safety. Because the reality is we know that that's not true. We haven't decreased crime by increasing our prison system by 300% since the 70s. So we have to do something different if we want to get something different.
And Mr. Williams.
So the Orange County Jail has been called the largest mental health facility in Orange County for quite some time for all the reasons that you and the other candidates have discussed. And that's, it's more than a problem, it's a tragedy. As far as the homeless population or the unsheltered, I think you start with a conversation with law enforcement about not making arrests for those crimes. I mean, that there are other options in those situations. And I think absent some sort of safety emergency, those are the crimes that law enforcement really needs to use better judgment in not making arrests for. They're not, to my knowledge, they're not prevalent making arrests for those, but it does happen. And that should not almost never happen. So that's one of the concrete things I would do as far as the unsheltered population goes. As far as mental health, I agree that this is a distinct area where law enforcement, particularly that extra $15 million that I told you the sheriff's office was referring to, I'd be willing to bet that our publicly funded mental health agencies here in Orange and Osceola County could do wonders with that $15 million. The reality is that we have tried it the other way and it's not working, and we have to try something else. And if that means shifting those resources away from law enforcement, again, not suggesting that we make our officers or the community unsafe, but that we try to address this longstanding problem, then I'm in support of that, yes.
Thank you. So we are coming up on our last question, and then we're going to do closing statements. I want to ask about immigration. So one of the most vulnerable populations during the pandemic is the immigrant community, and over 21% of Florida's population are immigrants. In addition to enhanced pandemic vulnerabilities, the criminal legal system profoundly impacts how immigrant communities interact with federal agencies and the Trump administration. So let's start with you, Mr. Williams. Should prosecutors consider collateral immigration consequences in charging decisions, plea offers, and sentencing recommendations? And what effect should those considerations have?
Yes, they should consider them. And I'll start at the beginning of the process and work my way forward. They should be trained on what they are and make sure that they recognize that a plea or being charged with some offenses will automatically result in deportation, whereas pleas to other or charges of others will not affect their status or have a less of effect on their status. We need to be cognizant of the consequences of our actions for immigrants. If you commit a no valid driver's license or some sort of driving offense, it shouldn't have a punishment of separating you from your family or a member of your family for the rest of your life. So we need to make sure, and I would make sure, that we train our prosecutors on what those consequences are. It is a factor. It is not the factor in every situation. And every situation is different. If it's a minor crime and charging that crime or requiring a plea to it is going to result in deportation, then that's a significant factor. If it's a more significant crime and deportation is a possibility, then it's a factor, but not the dominant factor. So we need to train prosecutors to recognize what those consequences are and to consider them significantly and seriously when dealing with each individual case. And every case is different. I mean, to me, the immigration consequences for a single male who is here alone in this country are different than they are for the father of three who's supporting the family and has family here and ties to the community. But those are the things that in my view, we should be looking at as prosecutors.
Thank you. Ms. Vera, what do you think the prosecutor should consider as far as collateral consequences go, plea offer, sentencing recommendation?
Sure. I think you need to consider everything, really. I look at immigration on both sides of things. I've had issues where victims of crime don't want to come forward because they're afraid of deportation, coming into a courthouse where there's deputies. And I've had to sit down with them and talk to them about that in terms of, I don't care what your status is, you don't deserve to be a victim of a crime, and we need to get justice. And then on the other side, I've dealt with people accused of crimes and defendants where, yes, the consequence of deportation is far too extreme than the penalty or the punishment for whatever crime it is that they did. And so I think that as a prosecutor, you have to look at the individual person. The whole criminal justice system is set up to be about people, who they are, what their circumstances are, so that we can come up with a just resolution. And whatever that resolution is, it has to be just and fair given the circumstances.
And Ms. Worrell?
So we'll always consider immigration status in resolving criminal cases. We'll try to offer diversion whenever it's possible. Diversion can help undocumented individuals avoid deportation that often follows from criminal convictions. But this isn't different. It's just one more thing that we'll be doing on a broader scale. We'll seek to divert as many cases as we can to avoid convictions for as many people as we can. That is consistent with public safety. A criminal record harms everyone in different ways, and in the long term, it increases the likelihood that people will reoffend in the future because that impacts their ability for employment. So while members of the immigrant community face even more dramatic and collateral consequences than most, my approach to these cases will be consistent with our overarching goals, and that is avoiding unnecessary harms imposed by the criminal legal system.
Thank you. So I want to give each of you just a moment to, oh my gosh, we're doing fine on time. This is just remarkable. It's the only time I've ever been fine on time, so this is great. I'm going to give each of you just a moment to give your closing statement. And I want to start with you, Ms. Vera.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and to talk about our views. This race is really important, and it's important for the voters to know who we are and where we stand. And I am a trial attorney, I am a prosecutor, and I'm proud of those two things. I'm proud of those two things because I've been fighting for victims of crime. And I've been doing it for 17 years. And as the state attorney, you have to fight for victims of crime. That is your job responsibility to keep the community safe. The second part to that is to keep the innocent safe as well, because safety is across the board. And people need to know that if they're wrongfully accused of a crime, that the state attorney's office is going to get it right. And I have spent 17 years looking and reviewing cases, dropping cases, understanding that what our job is as state attorney and as assistant state attorneys is to do the right thing. We are public servants, we serve the public, and we have to protect the innocent as much as we have to convict the guilty. And that is what I bring to the table as the state attorney. And I'm asking for your vote on August 18th. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Unmute. I told you it would happen once.
Waited till the last question.
A good portion and a majority in some places of our country has every right not to trust anything that law enforcement or prosecutors say. And in fact, they have a right to be fearful. And I can appreciate how members of our community want to elect those promising reform to important positions like district or state attorney or sheriff, no matter if they have very little or in some instances no experience doing job they seek to those positions. I get it. But just as we don't assume all police officers are bad, I don't think we should assume all prosecutors are bad either. And I would suggest to you that so long as the prosecutor has a record of holding police accountable and supporting the reforms that are important to you in this nation, then they're worthy of your trust and support. In fact, I believe that those trustworthy prosecutors are the absolute best hope for bringing about real and lasting reform to our criminal justice system, because they bring credibility to a conversation that, to succeed, must bring people to the table who have not traditionally supported bail and bond reform, the elimination of min-mans, and reduced incarceration. So I believe my willingness to personally fight to hold law enforcement accountable and my own personal experiences as a family member of an incarcerated person gives the citizens of Orange and Osceola County some reasons to trust my desire to bring about that important change while also protecting our community and its families. So I ask our community to consider that and consider voting for me for state attorney on or before August 18th. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Worrell.
I agree that this is a very important election. This is a turning point in our nation, but in our community specifically. I think that the citizens of Central Florida have said that they've had enough. And I've seen and spoken to them over the last month as I have attended the protests. And we have our own issues here in Central Florida that are akin to those across the nation. And while my opponents attempt to use the fact that I've not served as a prosecutor as a weakness, I encourage everyone to look at that as the greatest strength in this race, because I can see things differently while they can only see it from their very limited perspective as a prosecutor. I understand that the intersection between victims and defendants mean that when I protect the rights of defendants, that I also protect the rights of victims, and that they are not a mutually exclusive group with one being evil and the other one always being righteous. I understand the fact that in order to hold law enforcement officers accountable, we have to protect citizens from their abuse. And that starts early before their abuse turns into murder. And the reality of it is that I have practiced criminal law for 20 years. And there is not one single thing that any of my opponents can point to that I don't understand about the practice of criminal law. People leave the practice of law every day to become judges. Prosecutors leave the prosecutor's office to become defense attorneys. It is an interchangeable position to take. I understand the practice of law because I've not only practiced, but I've also taught. I've also tried dozens of cases. So I am an experienced criminal law practitioner, and I am more than qualified to be the next state attorney. But if what we really want is change, if what we really want is reform, then you have to rely on the only person who has dedicated their career to criminal justice reform. If you want more of the same, if you want more of prosecution, then you can rely on those who that's all they've done. I am the one who can fight for and lead the charge for reform. And because of that, I ask for your vote on August 18th. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you. I know you're in the middle of an election, taking time out of your day to join us. We really appreciate it. This concludes our Orange Osceola County State Attorney Forum. A reminder to everybody watching, primary election day is on Tuesday, August 18th. If you are voting by mail, your ballot must be received, not postmarked, but received by 8:00 p.m. on election day. So be sure to get it to the mailbox a few days early. Thank you so much to the candidates and to everyone that joined us today. We appreciate it. And we'll be tuning in on August 18th.